G'day, mate. 40 here. It is a rainy Sunday morning here in Sydney. It is 9:53 a.m., January 22nd, and there's a terrific Richard Hanania Substack essay where he argues that the media are honest and good. What the hell is he talking about? So there is a podcast discussion between Richard Hanania and Michael Tracey. So let's join that.
Much longer than I expected, but I didn't begrudge the length at all. It was a warranted read. So,
that's Michael Tracey speaking.
Yeah, people should look it up, but I'm just sort of curious, how long in the making was it? I mean, have you been pondering over the subject for a while? Or just briefly summarize what it is.
Yeah, most Substacks I'm thinking about for a while, sometimes for years, and then I just finally get around to writing something's progressing in my head.
Pondering
actually
over
writing
the subject
for a few days. But yeah, I mean, my motivation was, I think I'm just so sick of these stupid people on Twitter. Like,
that's what we're all motivated by primarily nowadays.
I mean, we criticize the media and we say, oh, they got this wrong and they did that. But it's like, I've just been watching, and I think it's got dumber since Elon Musk took over. I was sort of excited when Elon Musk took over. I thought, like, oh, we're going to have, just less PC and less censorship. But it's like, it seems like there some really, really dumb, like, right-wing people have been emboldened. And they're just dumb. I mean, their critiques of the media are not like fair. It's like, here's this headline of like the New York Times saying X, and then here's that headline of like a different op-ed columnist like 6 months later saying Y. Like, oh, the media has lost credibility. Nothing makes
like they caught the hypocrisy.
Yeah, I have a thread of like those people who are going to Davos and like harassing Klaus Schwab. And it's all so dishonest. Like I saw one, these people have like hundreds of thousands of followers. They have more followers than major like New York Times journalists. And one of them was like, they had a 15-second clip from the Davos, and there was some Saudi guy was there, and the Saudi guy was just like, there are going to be no cars. There's going to be this, that. I knew what he was talking about. He was obviously talking about the city that they're building out in the desert. I know that's the plan. Like no cars, like no. And this person just took this clip and said the Saudis went to Davos to take away your cars, right? Basically. And it's like, okay, Saudis like don't want people to use cars. Like their entire economy is like oil, right? It makes no sense. It's just so stupid. and they're just like, and they're just doing this like like nothing. And for all like we complain about the New York Times and Washington Post, like these people with huge followings who criticize the media, they're 1,000 times worse. I mean, that's the dumb people on Twitter. And then like if you go to conservative media, it's not as bad as like these the stupidest people on Twitter, but it's pretty bad. I mean, they're not giving you any information about the world. If you go to Breitbart's front page, it's just like Biden farted. Biden's economy sucks. It's like a Hannity, like it's like a website of just like Hannity segments. I mean, there's nothing there. There's no information. Like New York Times, you avoid the partisan stuff, and you avoid the really biased stuff, and you can learn things from the paper, right? You can go to the science section, or you can go to the business section, and you can read a great article. You can read about Myanmar's civil war, and just like people who criticize media, they don't produce any knowledge, right? They're just grifters. Right. And so I got annoyed. I'm like, yeah, I've been like with you people like criticizing the media for a while, but it's got to be tempered. And just to say like the media sucks and the media, they're terrible. And a lot of people just like they make their entire sort of public profile of just like trying to discredit the New York Times. It's just not healthy. And I don't think.
Yeah. So a few potential qualifiers here to raise.
Okay, so you're complaining about the news media. Well, have you considered this epic rant here from Canada? Right, there's that Canadian hockey player who didn't want to wear pride regalia.
Three things technically. Provorov also spoke to the media after the game, and echoed what Tortorella said. So I didn't feel the need to run it. This happened in baseball last year with the Tampa Bay Rays. There were 5 members of the Tampa Bay Rays who wouldn't wear a patch supporting gay rights. Mm-hmm. And Major League Baseball didn't do much. It was a story for a little bit. John Tortorella, many years ago, when racial injustice, and it still is till this day, but when Colin Kaepernick first started kneeling during national anthem, said anyone who does that on my team is going to sit. And he has a son who's an Army Ranger. So it's not like Tortorella in the past hasn't spoken on sensitive issues. The theme from the National Hockey League is hockey is for everyone, okay? The theme is not hockey is for everyone, ... unless you don't believe in gay rights, then do whatever you want. If the National Hockey League is going to do this, if any league is going to do this, do it properly or reevaluate what you're doing. Because there's not a lot of repercussions that I'm seeing from any league. Now, it could change with the NHL. I think you find the Flyers $1 million for this. I'm not kidding. Figure this out and stop offending people on nights where it's not about that. It's supposed to be about inclusivity. The National Hockey League need to attack this and figure this out. Because what I heard last night was offensive and didn't make any sense. Because, for instance, if that was a military night, okay?
Right.
If anyone in Canada or in the States on a military appreciation night wouldn't wear a jersey pregame. Do you have any idea the uproar that would have happened on that? Do you have any idea the backlash? Do you have any idea what happened on social media? It's ridiculous what would have happened.
Look, it was just a minute ago we were talking about the uproar that was happening with FIFA fever, where if you were seen with so much as a rainbow anywhere, you had to fear for your life, imprisonment, or death.
Yeah.
Seriously. So, and now here we are.
I just think the NHL has to do something here. This is not good enough. This is not good enough. Hockey is for everyone, ... unless you don't agree with gay rights is not the phrasing of this. You're either in this or you're not. And one last point. Nothing scares me more than any human being who says, I'm not doing this because of my religious beliefs. Because when you looked at people's lives, you normally say that publicly, you'd throw up at what you saw. You would throw up at what you saw. And I have seen that a million times in a lot of different ways. So don't give me that. With respect. Don't give me that, because no one's perfect. All right? Don't tell me, don't feed me the religious beliefs line. And all of a sudden the NHL is going to back off this. The National Hockey League today needs to find that organization $1 million and reevaluate how they support gay rights. Because that is insulting. That is the #1 trending topic in Canada. That is insulting what happened in Philadelphia. And if the NHL is serious about this, they say they are. We'll see. We'll see how serious they are today. But that whole thing was mishandled, and part of me couldn't believe it. Part of me could, considering how the NHL sometimes handles things.
And it's too important, and that's why you're continuing to talk about it, because you're not just going to brush it under the rug.
Well said, Dee.
Yeah, so journalists are crying because the National Hockey League is not sufficiently supportive of gay rights. And again, the argument that it's offensive is just
three things, technically.
Subjective.
Provorov also spoke to the media.
Just a completely subjective argument. And Richard Hanania has a funny remark. He says, this is a strike against physiognomy. One could imagine this guy easily having been casually sexist a generation ago, making edgy race jokes. Now he's a blubbering fool, demanding that everyone wear gay pride. So we have Richard Hanania discussing whether the media is honest and good with Michael Tracey. So Michael Tracey here is pushing back.
And I'm not going to do justice to the entire article because it's very long and worth reading, but just a sort of smattering of thoughts here. And this first one relates to you saying what you did just then. I've always been of the mind that there actually is real value in media criticism. It's always been a significant component of what I do. I try to incorporate it into other forms of analysis that I might engage in. You can even incorporate it into reporting to some degree. I know you aren't really doing reporting per se, but it's not like reporting is this exotic concept that you can only do if like you're a certified journalist or whatever. It's a pretty straightforward just process of gathering information and using reason and adherence to facts to check it out for accuracy and then report it in an intelligible, comprehensible way that sort of adds to collective understanding in some sense. I always thought that kind of reporting can often be enhanced by a kind of underlying media critique, right? So, and there are even like historical examples of this. I.F. Stone, right? Who had his own, he was on Substack before there was a Substack. He actually had a self-funded newsletter that people paid for and he printed and sent all over the country, and he did some of his own reporting, but a lot of it was media criticism because he had like sort of a unique skill and depth of knowledge where he could curate articles and clippings from a wide variety of sources that most people would have had access to or like the time or means of finding on their own and criticize them and or add additional context. There was a lot of foreign policy stuff, particularly Vietnam for a span of time. But that was sort of his bread and butter, or at least a big element of it, right? And even today, I mean, Glenn Greenwald, when he first started blogging, it was largely a media criticism blog. And I guess I have to have somewhat revised my perspective on the value of media criticism, only insofar as now because everybody's a media critic, everybody and their mother, and they have a platform.
Okay, question from the chat. I had a relapse earlier this week. I watched internet pornography. I must get back on the right track. I do not want to be degenerate. So when you have what we call a relapse, what's going on is that internet pornography in the moment is meeting your needs better than whatever you were substituting for internet pornography. So you've got basic needs, you need to get them met. So some people get their needs met through prayer, meditation, community, camaraderie, say a 12-step program, church, synagogue, but you need to feel connected, right? You need to be living a life that is generally happy, joyous, and free. And so when you have a relapse, it simply indicates that whatever the addiction is, that participating in that addiction in the moment is more effective at meeting your needs than whatever it is that you're doing. So you need to figure out what is it that you're doing that is not meeting your needs, and what are healthy ways of meeting your needs for excitement. So I have a need for excitement, and I write blog posts, I make podcasts, I do live streams. I have all sorts of ways of trying to meet my need for excitement. I watch true crime documentaries. I watch disaster documentaries. I watch aircraft crashing documentaries, because that kind of meets that wicked urge in me for excitement without making me feel disgusted and degraded afterwards, such as I would often feel when consuming pornography. So you're doing the best you can, Rune, with the tools that you have at your availability. So it's time for perhaps adding some new tools, doing some things differently, so that you're more effective at meeting your needs for excitement. Right? You need excitement. Why not a good air crash documentary? Or you feel ill at ease with yourself. So would it be prayer that would help? Would it be meditation? Would it be exercise? Do you need more community? Do you need more people in your life? So relapse to me is a sign that the addiction, in the moment at least, is more effective at meeting your needs than your regular life. All right, back to Michael Tracey.
It seems to like dilute the value of media criticism. So I think maybe retroactively what I was putting some value on myself was just the handful of media critics that happen to be smart, right? That happen to be adding something, that actually happen to have sort of like an analytical depth to what they're saying that actually is illuminating and does like cut through illogic or false consensus or artificially constructed narratives.
Okay, speaking of narratives in the media, let's catch up with Fox News.
Give legal cover to. If you re-elect Joe Biden, the Department of Justice, if it doesn't change its policy, can't indict him because he's a sitting president. If you elect Donald Trump, he could very well grant himself a self-pardon. And that makes for a rather odd election.
Do you think that because President Biden came down so hard on former President Trump for his document collection at Mar-a-Lago, is that part of the reason that the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland felt he had no choice but to appoint a special counsel here?
Well, John, part of the reason for the appointment of a special counsel is that Garland had no alternative. I mean, the standard is gross mishandling of classified material. I don't know what else you would call classified documents held essentially in the open for 6 years and found in a closet, a garage, and your personal library. There's no.
So how did Biden's team get away with keeping this quiet for 70 days, right? Prior to the midterm elections, the Biden team knew that he mishandled classified information. And how come this news didn't break prior to the midterm elections? So in the Trump case, you had a torrent of leaks, you had the FBI raid, right? Why weren't FBI agents present at the retrieval of these classified documents, right? So Biden's lawyers were able to conduct the additional searches. Both sides agreed that Biden's personal attorneys would inspect the homes, right? No FBI agents present. So former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy says his decision boggles the mind. So you had some of these initial documents were classified at the highest security level, were discovered in an office that didn't open until 2018, meaning they were moved there from another unauthorized location, right? So how come these searches weren't done by federal law enforcement agents such as the FBI? You would think that only agents with the highest security clearances could do this. Instead, the process is left entirely to Joe Biden's private lawyers who do not have security clearance. And they also then get to craft the circumstances of the discovery, like where they were, their condition, whether they're easily observable, right? So why are there no federal agents? Right? This is an extraordinary level of trust that is being given to Joe Biden's team. So putting Biden's legal team in charge means there's no public FBI display to equate the Biden document mess to the Trump one. So yeah, keep the FBI out of it. Much easier to say that Biden is handling things differently. Okay, let's have an eye here. Let's go back to Michael Tracey here talking to Richard Hanania about the news media.
Now, this isn't to say that I object to the common man having the ability to engage in media criticism. Anybody should, and some of those common men critics will sort of like rise to the top of the heap and prove that they actually are doing something worthwhile. But I do agree that a lot of it is pretty much worthless. And just a quick anecdote that sort of illustrates part of what I'm talking about here, and I mentioned this recently to somebody else. In June, I think, or July of 2020, I went on this sort of 2+ month nationwide sort of journalism trip to go to as many of the George Floyd protest locations as I could, talk to as many people as I could from different backgrounds. You probably recall that. I think it might be probably around the time we first sort of met. And there was one time where I was in Chicago, right, in the blazing hot sun. I believe it was Juneteenth. I went to 2 like big protests. I spent all day, working. I mean, it's not the most backbreaking work, like I'm on an assembly line or digging ditches or anything, but it's what I do for work. Okay. And I, at one point, just chatted with a police officer and got the police officer sort of observation about something was happening, and just tweeted out just a little excerpt of what the officer told me. I don't even remember what it was now. And I remember this guy, Jeet here, you know him.
Oh yeah, I love Jeet.
Jeet on Twitter is the handle.
Yeah, Jeet is just everything about Jeet is just perfect. Go look up Jeet.
Oh, I have a love-hate relationship with him. Actually, we sort of, even though we've been fighting for like 8 years, we have like I sense that we have like some underlying like semi-ironic fondness for each other. But I don't know.
That's cute. I wish he.
Yeah, he's actually
does on me sometimes, but he doesn't quote tweet me. He takes a picture, and I just wish Jeet would engage directly so we can have a relationship together.
Yeah, he's been nice to me in private. Because I hadn't written for The Nation in a while, even though that's where I started in 2010, and I wanted to write something for them in 2020, and he was like an editor there at that point, or a writer, and he helped like set up me to be able to write a piece. So I didn't really know who to contact at that point, or hadn't really been following who was like the right person to go to. Anyway, so he's done stuff like that for me, on which I appreciate. But so I tend to take in good humor some of what he does. But there was this one particular sort of jab that he took at me, just rubbed me the wrong way, because I put out this little quote from an officer. And again, bear in mind, I'm quoting and talking to all kinds of people. It's not like I'm just doing 24/7, conveyor belts dissemination of whatever I hear from cops to like promote a pro-cop narrative or something. But it's a relevant part of the story if you're covering the protest movement, right? So I did that, and then I get a repost from Jeet where he's like basically accusing me of being a hypocrite, right? Because most of the time I would never just at face value take what cops are saying as gospel and spread it out. Like basically I'm betraying what I had pretended were my values of like skepticism toward government officials, which is a pretty weighty thing to extrapolate from one little.
Okay, Kevin Michael Gray says an interesting tweet. When I was a reporter, he says, I always ask cops and prosecutors whether they'd ever seen anyone framed for a crime. They always said no. Truth is that cops routinely manufacture evidence to frame people they believe to be guilty. So this gets the bigger issue. The question of today's stream is, what should you expect from the news? And so I'm a big believer. I think it's self-evidently true that the more your expectations meet reality, the happier you'll feel, and the more sense of an agency you'll feel, the more sense that you have some control over your life. And so when we evaluate whether the media is good or bad, we should evaluate whether the media is good or bad at what. So I tell you that the media is good at reporting what bureaucracies tell them, right? So you've got the National Football League right now. This bureaucracy is staging some games that I'm watching in the background. So currently the Kansas City Chiefs lead the Jacksonville Jaguars 17-10, right? And so the National Football League is staging this game. The National Football League is a bureaucracy, and the media does an accurate job at reporting the score, right? And reporting, who wins and who loses, and they do a pretty good job also of analyzing why. So another function of the news is to tell you the weather. And so I'm in Sydney, and I often look at the weather on my Apple iPhone, and it says it's dry and windy outside, when I can look out my window and I see it's raining. So all weather forecasters pretty much get their information from the same government agency, right? So government bureaucracy releases satellite imagery and weather information. And then that's, of course, imperfect. So the news does a good job of essentially reporting what the government tells them about the weather. Now, when the news takes the second step and stands outside and says, okay, even though the weather forecast says right now it should be dry, it's actually raining, right? That's an improvement. So you can't just accept what the government tells you at face value. So sometimes you'll have news stations like Hype, storm of the century, and you've only got like a light pitter patter of snow coming down, but everyone's staying home because the news says storm of the century. So do you trust the news or do you trust your lying eyes? So sometimes your eyes are a far more accurate window onto reality than the news. So if there's a topic that you know well, inevitably you will be more right about that topic than the news, because you, I would hope, would have some specialized information, while journalists tend to be generalists. So the news gives you essentially what bureaucrats give the reporters, and then they hype it to try to make it as exciting and consequential as possible to command your attention. And then against your attention, they sell advertising, subscriptions, or they recruit government subsidies for what they're doing. So when the news media hypes a story, this is just a subsection of lying, right? So generally speaking, just like cops and prosecutors tell you, oh, I've never heard of anyone being framed, right? Journalists unanimously seem to think that hyping a story is completely justified, but hyping is lying. So the news media is routinely lying to you about the relative importance of the stories that they're reporting to you, but they want to try to command your attention. So is it more heinous than the way that products, hype their importance? No, not necessarily. So when you evaluate, is the news media good or bad, it has to be on the question of good or bad at what. And so when you understand what the news does is primarily report the accounts, the documents, the opinions of bureaucrats, and the results of these bureaucratically orchestrated events, then you don't expect the news to necessarily correlate with what's really of most importance going on in the world around you. So the news is good at reporting what bureaucrats tell them, all right? Not so good necessarily at evaluating the validity of what bureaucrats tell them.
Little excerpt of a tweet when you have like 280 characters, and I wanted to just put out an interesting quote, right? And so I just thought to myself, okay, this guy's sitting on his ass somewhere, I think Saskatchewan. I'm in the beating sun at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Chicago in the middle of the dog days of summer. I've been like traveling around, trying to like gain an understanding of like a major event that's happening in the country that requires some semblance of reporting to like develop a more robust understanding of. He's sitting on his ass. I think he's in Saskatchewan. I don't know, some like Canadian province or part of Canada where like nothing ever happened, so he focuses 100% on the United States, which, okay, fair enough. He would never even have the notion of doing any kind of reporting on the issue. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to be a reporter, right? And I go spend the time where I don't do like on the ground, reporting for, whatever reason that much, although I try to do some over the...
Come on, Michael. Jed here seems to weigh 300, 400 pounds. You can't expect him to get out on the streets and do reporting, bro.
Course of what I am focused on at any given time. But, I'm not saying that I'm like the most intrepid investigative reporter on the face of the earth, but I've done reporting over the years, right? And I was doing a lot of it at that particular period. And I just get this like guy sniping at me out of nowhere who's in the media, by the way, writing for a national publication, and like never even had the faintest idea to get off his ass for once and like maybe go talk to somebody and like get a quote or whatever. Yeah. And I'm just being raked over the coals because I tweeted a quote, and I was just like, I had the same sort of visceral reaction that you seem to have. You seem to have that kind of prompted this piece, and just like, you know what, screw off. I mean, what do you do? What are you contributing? And maybe it was a bit like overwrought. And he may not have done some reporting over years, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, when you get stuff like that constantly from like the peanut gallery, it does sort of engender this sort of more antagonistic reaction that's just sort of festers in you, and then at some point you kind of have to just let loose.
Yeah, I mean, and there's entire like media, sites that are just nothing but this stuff, right? That don't contribute anything. It's an entire business model.
So most breaking news is of no significance. And I'm inspired by a 1984 article by a professor of communications here, Sandra Berman. So most breaking news, right, no significance. Most of what's in the news is not terribly significant, all right? So news tends to focus on things like elections, the development of constitutions, words used in political doctrines, right? And so the New York Times, follows, the narrative of objective journalism of reporting what government bureaucracies and official statements relate to them. So the New York Times uses primarily official information sources from various bureaucrats. So the live streamer or the blogger or the quote unquote the new journalist, right? They will often write more from the individual or speak from the individual perspective. So they would perhaps try to put themselves in as many different situations as possible, try to receive information from all their senses, sight, hearing, smell, touch. right? And they may consider official information sources, but they're not necessarily the most reliable, right? Comments at a drugstore may be far more reliable than official pronouncements from the Department of Commerce. So what the New York Times pegs as news is basically the passage of bureaucratically recognized events through administrative procedures. So the New York Times focuses on elections, government reports, things like that. Now, the skeptic, the outsider, the blogger, the live streamer will recognize that there's not necessarily a full correlation between official government reports and what's going on in reality. And so a lot of things are done for symbolic reasons that don't have much real life significance. So Joan Didion, okay, quintessential new journalist. She wrote from her own experience of life. And so is the news good? Yeah, it's good at reporting to you what bureaucrats and experts tell it. Is the news good at then evaluating what they're told and checking to see whether it matches up with reality? Not so much.
Model. There's a lot of influencers. I mean, people, I think, just maybe they assume like the mainstream media is so powerful, and like all these other people on Twitter don't matter. But there are really big liars out there who have hundreds of thousands, some cases millions of followers. So a lot of these people are actually influential.
Yeah, but these people you're talking about, like Ben Shapiro, he's not posing as a journalist. All right, he is a pundit. He is someone who gives people reliably conservative opinions on what's going on in the world around them.
And so, yeah, I mean, and if you just compare, like the New York Times does not, the New York Times isn't going to butcher they've probably done it a few times in their history, but they're not going to butcher a quote like that they did on the Saudi guy, right? The Sam Harris, have you seen the Sam Harris stuff that people have been dunking on him on, even though he's not on Twitter anymore?
That little clip where he's on some podcast or show where he's talking about like what would have been the case if like COVID were like a few degrees worse or something.
Yeah, and so like they made it like so he goes there was anti-vax and he doesn't like anti-vax, and he's like we got we wouldn't have had that if COVID killed children rather than old people mostly, and that's he goes, so we got got unlucky in that respect because it wasn't children, so like anti-vax got taken over. Okay, like so like poorly worded, but then like people take it. Sam Harris, so unfortunate that all these children didn't die. It's like no, he's just making the point.
Yeah, like he's like Sam Harris. Like, the point of what Sam Harris was saying is that he was yearning for more children to have died during COVID.
That was basically
like I agree with some of the stuff that Sam Harris has been banging on about for several years now, especially since Trump came on the scene, has been a bit tedious. I'm not a regular consumer of what he does. I was for a little while. I read his book in like high school on religion and stuff. So I've been familiar with him for some time. And I actually do think he actually also wrote a book on meditation that was sort of influential on me. And I because of that and other stuff, I did meditation retreats and sort of improved my emotional welfare to some degree. So I don't have like just this reflexive antipathy for Sam Harris, and I could recognize that he's been annoying in certain respects, maybe with regard to some COVID stuff. I don't really know. I don't follow. I'm not that interested in COVID debates at this point, given other stuff that's going on. But yeah, even if you don't like him, or even if you think that like he's obnoxious and imperious on his like vaccine-related crusade that he's been on against like other members of the intellectual dark web or whatever, it's not necessary to like watch that clip and conclude that his purpose in articulating what he articulated there was to long for the mass death of children. Like that clearly was not the purpose of like the portion of the argument he was.
So if you put people in their proper genre, they're going to disappoint you less, right? You're going to be much more effective in life because your expectations of other people, other institutions, and of yourself will be much more in alignment with reality. So Sam Harris is a hysterical pundit, all right? He's very emotional, over the top. That's what he does. He's hysterical, and that's what you should expect when you check out Sam Harris. Like Dennis Prager tries to ground his analysis in the Bible, and so applying the Bible to what's going on today, not an easy task, but that's his calling card. Like taking an ethical monotheist approach to the news. And George Will, all right, conservative academic approach to what's going on in the world around us. So Crystal Light, classic orange drink, all right? It's reliable. I just mix it with water. It tastes like fresh squeezed orange juice. Has very few calories. People, however, tend to be much more complicated than most products. But once you put them in their correct genre, right, they're less likely to shock you. You shouldn't expect rabbis to be physicists. You don't expect accountants to be comics. You don't expect the homeless to be Shakespeare scholars. On occasion they might be, but don't expect this and you won't get disappointed. When it comes to a nationally syndicated radio talk show host, you expect them to be interesting to a 100 IQ audience, and that's about it. You don't expect them to be scholars. So you look at the front page of the New York Times, and what you'll see largely are proclamations from bureaucracies. Okay, go to the New York Times right now. Top story, inside the Supreme Court inquiry, all right? The production of the United States Supreme Court investigation, which completely failed over who leaked the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? Most abortion bans include exceptions. In practice, few are granted. So this is the experience of people with bureaucracies in anti-abortion states. A hit French novel tries to explain Putin too well, some critics say. So leading members of the culture wars and foreign policy establishment are weighing in on a novel. The US will keep thousands of troops deployed in Romania. Right, this is what's going on with NATO. Despite frustrations at Germany, Ukraine expresses optimism it will receive Leopard tanks. All right, getting what bureaucrats are saying. How a startup founder got JP Morgan to pay $175 million for nothing. Right, what's going on in a banking bureaucracy? Ron Klain is expected to step down as White House chief of staff. What's going on in the Biden administration bureaucracy? In Omaha, a streetcar named Undesirable by Warren Buffett. Okay, so what's going on in Omaha, city government bureaucracy, and Warren Buffett, who's got a bureaucracy under him in investing. The fierce life and sudden death of America's strongest woman. So here, rare individual focus to a story. Brazil's defender of the indigenous shares their fight with the world. So this is about a photographer in Brazil. Also, her clashes with Brazilian democracy. One of the most influential ambassadors in Washington isn't one, so this is Taiwan's representative. This is a representative of a bureaucracy, the state of Taiwan. So she walks a diplomatic line. China calls her a troublemaker who could incite a law. So when you look at the news, it's, again, primarily what bureaucracies are reporting. So during the run-up to the Iraq invasion in 2003, the Bush administration pushed the narrative that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and the mainstream media, with the exception of Knight Ridder, largely went along with it. The mainstream media didn't do their due diligence. This is where the media does not tend to be so great, right? They're not so good at questioning official sources. So I broke my biggest stories, right, relying on unofficial sources. So starting in 1997, I noticed that there were all these porn stars who were routinely testing HIV positive, and there were no mainstream media reports on this. And I tracked down the most likely source of infection to be Mark Wallace, right? Likely patient zero. And so I relied on unofficial sources to break a huge story that a male member of the San Fernando Valley heterosexual pornography industry was transmitting HIV to a dozen or more actresses. I relied on unofficial sources. Eventually, the official sources came along to confirm what I said, and turned out to be a big story in Los Angeles, and then resonated around the world. In 2004, I published a story about a rabbi, Aaron Tendler, who was the head of the largest Orthodox synagogue in the San Fernando Valley. And he had claims of sexual abuse made against him going back decades. And I reported on this. There was no official sources. I got unofficial sources on this. Eventually, I got two women who were students of his at the Yeshiva University Los Angeles Girls High School. And when I was able to get their detailed stories, he immediately stepped down. So I reported primarily on the basis of unofficial sources. When the details became undeniable, then official people stepped in and had this rabbi step down. In 2007, I reported that the mayor of Los Angeles was no longer wearing a wedding ring and that his marriage was over. The Los Angeles Times went to the mayor to get his response. He denied it. He essentially lied. But then it quickly became clear that the mayor had a marriage that was finished and that he'd been carrying on an affair with a Spanish language TV news reader in Los Angeles. And so that was essentially the end of Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa's career. So I essentially ended his career, or started the movement that ended his career, thanks to his behavior, based on unofficial sources. And then the regular news media followed me, started trying to pile on official sources. So it's a lot easier if you can have official sources, because you're much less likely to get sued, right? If you rely on unofficial sources, you're much more likely to get sued. So the news is primarily what bureaucracies report. And if you can't base your news on some bureaucratic piece of paper, you're kind of swimming outside the normal news business, because you normally cannot get sued for simply reporting what a bureaucracy releases. So I was reading a few months ago Paul Pringle's 2022 book, Bad City, Peril and Power in the City of Angels, about corruption between the Los Angeles Times and University of Southern California. And so he writes here, a key line in the Pasadena police report was not redacted. The one listing witnesses to the overdose entered there was the name of a single witness, and this was the head of the USC medical school. His relationship to the victim was described as friend. And the rest of the line noted he was a 65-year-old white male. Finally, I now had an official record that placed this medical dean at the scene of the overdose. Right? The most important element of a tip was now confirmed by an official source. So he had unofficial sources that were irrefutable, but he needed to get that official piece of paper before he had any hope of publishing this in the LA Times, while a blogger could have just relied on unofficial sources. So he says, I now had an official record that placed this medical dean at the scene of the overdose. The pressure on USC now to tell the truth about the dean was about to become crushing. So generally, institutions and bureaucracies do not like to respond to unofficial sources, but frequently unofficial sources much more accurate than official sources.
Sketching out?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's not what he meant, right? And it's, yeah, I mean, it's, and you know, you just have to think like, wow, like when you see all this stuff, it's like the things we complain about for like the New York Times and the Washington Post, oh, they didn't word this correctly, oh, this source maybe is not reliable. It's just like pales in comparison to like, you know, what big liars, like normal people who critique it.
Yeah. Okay, so let me do a more thoroughgoing pushback just to see how you reply to this. Because when I first started reading it, I thought to myself, okay, I know at some point he's got to do a qualifier where he says, you know, notwithstanding WMDs and Russiagate, such and such and such, and then, you know, that was basically almost what you said verbatim. So
yeah, when media got it wrong on Iraq having, under Saddam Hussein, having weapons of mass destruction, right? That was incredibly influential. All right, that wasn't just a mistake. Right, Chabad Rabbi turns anti-Semitic slur yelled at him into learning opportunity.
Lexington Rabbi is sharing his own story after he says a UK student directed an anti-Semitic slur at him on Saturday night. It comes as anti-Semitic incidents rise across the country. LAX 18's Ricky Sayer talked with the rabbi about how, rather than report the incident to the university, he took a very different route. That is tonight's big story at 5:30.
A menorah in plain sight, standing on his front lawn. A Lexington rabbi was spotted by two men standing on that back porch.
And one noticed me dressed as I am every day and yelled out, you know, we should kill the...
The anti-Semitic slur he used, which we will not say on TV, represents hate and exclusion. It came from...
Okay, so yelling, you know, kill the K's, that's more serious than your average slur, right? So yelling that we should start killing people, right? Yeah, I can see why there would be a response to that. All right, that's incendiary.
From a student partying after graduation.
Those words have tremendous violence and crimes behind them. And when you use that language, you associate yourself with those crimes.
Chabad of the Bluegrass Rabbi Shlomo Litvin had to know who said it. He's called to...
Okay, I'm not sure that if you use that language when you're drunk at a party that you're associated then with crimes. There's no connection between using this kind of hateful language and actually doing hateful things. As a journalist, I've had my life threatened hundreds of times, right? And no one seriously made an attempt on my life. So this is a vast overstatement that by using, you know, this kind of ugly language, he's then associated with actually carrying it out, right? People usually don't mean what they say, don't mean what they say, don't say what they mean. There's simply no empirical connection at a high level. There's no high correlation between the use of this kind of hateful language and then the carrying out of genocides. Genocides are pretty rare use of hateful language pretty common.
Cultivated relationships with his largely student neighbors around UK's Jewish centre, teaching them about a religion many knew little about.
When I went over there, they told me that one of the students had said that's an inappropriate thing to say, and their friends had gaslit them. It's not a big deal. Why are you being a party pooper?
For Litvin, no hateful act should go unchallenged. He waited for nearly an hour outside.
Okay, that's nonsense that no hateful action should go unchallenged. A lot of hateful words and actions should go unchallenged.
Inside the home.
And he sent out friends to try and shoo me away. And finally, he came out.
He told them how violence against Jews nearly wiped out his family in the 1930s and 40s.
I spoke about my great-grandmother's family in Ukraine, murdered with cries of "kill the Jews."
Violence extends to today, in Kentucky, even with him.
I personally have been threatened not by a kid yelling something across the street, but by people who intended to do me harm.
According to the Anti-Defamation League, anti-Semitic incidents hit an all-time high in 2021 in the U.S. at 2,717 incidents of assault, harassment, and vandalism, a 34% year-over-year increase.
This is a global problem and an American problem.
By the end of their conversation, the young man was apologetic.
This is one of the best ways it could have gone. I was able to connect with the student on a personal level.
It even ended with an invitation to learn more about Judaism.
I said, it's evident from your words you don't have any Jewish friends. If you did, you would never have made that comment. So come make a Jewish friend. Grab a coffee, we'll sit down, we'll talk.
In Lexington, Ricky Sayer.
Okay, I think that's an impressive and appropriate response by the rabbi. Someone saying, let's kill any group, and I mean, particularly aimed at you and your group, that you would want to call them out for it and confront them on it. Yeah, that seems appropriate. He didn't report him to school authorities. He didn't file a police report. He wanted a face-to-face confrontation with the guy. I think the rabbi did the right thing there. All right, this is Michael Tracey's critique of Richard Hanania's essay that the media are honest and good.
Here's what I would want to ask you. Okay, WMD's kind of a big deal. I mean, if the American media, which you're venerating as not being deserving of the scorn that's heaped on it, or not being a valid target for this kind of all-encompassing consternation that tends to be overrepresented among conservatives, because it's a fundamentally sort of truth-focused or truth-oriented institution, even if it commits failures. It's sometimes like part of the ethos is to correct those failures, whatever. That's sort of like a part of what you're saying here. Well, I mean, WMDs, if the American media was the key vehicle through which, let's just call it a lie for the sake of argument, right? I know people sometimes quibble with that, maybe not anymore. Let's just say an outright fabrication around the casus belli for war was peddled, crucially, by way of this kind of broader like ecosystem that you're trying to rehabilitate to some extent. Isn't that like a pretty cataclysmic blemish on their record that can't really just kind of be tossed aside as like maybe a niggling little inhibitor, but it actually sort of should frame one's understanding of what the media is as sort of like an organism? And likewise, Russiagate. I mean, it's sort of more complicated because it wasn't as though there was like one central lie akin to WMDs that you could point to as like the discrediting myth that was peddled. But, part of the reason why Russiagate was so insidious is because you would have this accumulation of frenzied, supposed bombshell stories over and over again, fed to New York Times, Washington Post in particular, through leaks, namely from the intelligence apparatus or the FBI or through like Adam Schiff's staffers or whatever. And then that would then be used to construct this incredibly sort of oppressive, in the sense of just its volume and saturation, narrative that really had some damaging effects that are far-ranging, and I would argue, and I'm working on something that's going to make this point in greater detail, I would argue are kind of central even to understanding what position the U.S. and the world is in now with regard to Ukraine and the risk of nuclear annihilation and so on. And so even if we're just limiting our counterexamples to those two, right, those seem like such potentially cataclysmic failures.
Okay, so
and have brought such damage that I'm to toss them aside in sort of the slightly casual way you did seems maybe not particularly justified.
Okay, so two things. First, before we get to the specifics of these, the argument I make is, look, the New York Times has been around for, I don't know how long it's been around for, but I know at least 120 years or something. The media as a whole. So you're gonna have a log. I mean, imagine if you were blogging for 120 years, how many things you would get wrong. So question, you can't just look through history to get a judgment of the media just by focusing on its biggest mistakes. Now these are big cases, granted. And I think that people, I think there's many ways they did a bad job. I think people they overestimate how much the media was at fault for these things, because look, this is intelligence. This is governments claiming and agencies within governments claiming things. Getting the truth is very hard. Now, the WMDs thing, the Bush administration, they convinced themselves. They themselves believed the WMDs were there. Now, these were the people who had, the access to the classified information. These were the people who were supposed to, were the best position to know. So, like, if they thought, if they were able to convince themselves of it, like, it's not like that surprising that, like, the media would do, right? I mean, they don't have.
But they wouldn't have been able to generate a consensus for war in the.
Yeah, a lot of people think, oh, if you got classified information, you got the real information. But frequently, the classified information is inferior to publicly accessible information. And just because information comes from a government or a bureaucracy or someone in power, it doesn't necessarily make it more accurate than what people out of power may have.
The populace, if they couldn't have funneled these fake certainties through the media to construct a narrative that then engendered the support.
What's the media supposed to do? I mean, if these government officials are telling you about background, oh, it's true, Saddam has WMDs. I don't
exercise discretion and exercise skepticism.
Yeah, Knight Ridder exercised discretion and skepticism of these claims of WMD. Knight Ridder, that journalistic enterprise, showed that these reports were false. Journalists generally don't do a good job at critiquing and analyzing what bureaucrats tell them.
And don't just mindlessly propagate what you're being fed by self-interested members of the national security apparatus, because they're usually full of crap, or full of crap often enough that you shouldn't be so sort of beguiled by them that you sort of become their PR agents. It's pretty, it's pretty straightforward to me.
Right. I'm not saying they didn't make mistakes. I'm saying that you can understand how this is.
It's not just a mistake. It's not like they spelled somebody's name wrong. I mean, it's beyond mistake.
Yeah, I mean, they put forward a false narrative. That's true. I mean, another thing we have to sort of remember about the Times, which is funny, is that, like, a lot of the pressure, like, for war, the most eager people for the war was not the New York Times. It was like the country music fans canceling the Dixie Chicks.
Yeah, there was upset on that actually in 2021. If people want to look it up.
But, like, a lot of the people who today, like, and sometimes they're the exact same people, and there are a lot of the same voters who hate the media and will say, look back at WMDs, how they got that wrong. These were the Freedom Prize folks, right? Who are gonna call you a traitor.
Yeah. Who told everyone to move to France.
Yeah. So like, the whole country sort of went insane. Like, I think the Bush administration is most to blame. And yeah, the New York Times did a bad job too after 9/11. Yeah, okay, yeah, but I mean, I think it has to be put in sort of that context. Yeah, I mean, the Russiagate thing. Yeah, I mean, Trump broke them. I mean, they're at the, it made them a little bit crazy. And yeah,
more than a little bit, but that's.
I don't actually think it's as consequential as WMDs. I mean, they did the Mueller report. I mean, the Mueller came back and they didn't have anything to charge him with. And yeah, it distorted our politics for a few years.
Well, it caused fewer direct deaths, but it had a similarly kind of sweeping, long-term deleterious impact, which I argue you can trace to, for example, why there's such an impenetrable consensus right now for just nonstop pro-war, policy in Ukraine, because Putin was public enemy number one, seen as installing the worst fascist menace that ever walked the earth, and Trump subverted our elections, introduced this whole sort of lexicon of like defending democracy against these interlopers that really, I think, broke brains on like several levels just beyond like the core story of Russiagate. Like, it had like this kind of multi-dimensional impact that was really damaging.
Yeah, although I mean, I don't think like everything that's called Russiagate. That it's like the Russiagate is like everything from Trump was Putin's spy to the Russians hacked the DNC, right? That was never proven false. I don't know how you feel about it. You think it's a good reason to believe that the Russians hacked the DNC and leaked it?
I think what I said when I read the Mueller reports section on that is that the preponderance of the evidence probably suggests that there was some Russian state-affiliated entity that was probably responsible, but.
So given that the left dominates almost all of our institutions, including the news media, it's not surprising that the narratives that the news media pushes, primarily from the left, particularly the bogus ones. And this is Edward Dutton.
Oh, hello, my friend. My name is Dirk Stapel, and I am professor of social psychology at the Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And I was a little bit busy there because what I'm doing is I'm concocting research. I'm making up data so that the data proves left-wing ideas, environmentalist ideas, to be correct. And I've been working at the moment on a very interesting paper that I'm doing where I show that carnivores are more selfish, and I let people eat meat, are more selfish and less moral than vegetarians. And I think I'm going to get this into a top journal such as Science or whatever, a really high-status journal. And I've got another paper where I show that if you expose people to bicycles that have been abandoned or that kind of thing, then they will become more stereotyping. They will be more likely to stereotype about people if they live in environments where there's lots of litter. And I think I'm going to get that in a good journal as well. Now, the problem is that if you do this kind of thing, then it means that it takes up a lot of the time, and it actually would be easier in terms of the time to just write articles, just do the research properly, and just publish it in normal journals. But the problem there is that you don't get the prestige. You don't get to go in the prestigious, the best journals. It's not so good for your career if you publish things that are not showing left-wing dogmas to be correct. So there's so much pressure on me to show that left-wing dogmas were correct that I spend more of my time making up data and making sure the data looks right superficially, making sure it looks okay, than would be the case if I simply did the research properly and submitted honest research to journals. So that's what I did. And so far, if we move into the future, by the year 2023, I've had 57 of my articles retracted for fraud and for making up the data, which is a record. So what we're basically seeing is a person, all of whose research proved the veracity of left-wing environmentalist ideas, and he did that by making up the data. Because if you don't make up the data, then normally it will prove that conservative ideas and hereditarianism are correct. Hello, 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 and welcome to this edition of The Jolly Heretic. Now, today I'd like to talk about a very interesting finding that has come to light on a website called Reversals in Psychology. And this looks at studies which do not replicate, for which there is only very weak evidence, or are simply fraudulent or manipulated. And what it finds, although they haven't actually bothered to do the calculations, I did that, is that overwhelmingly the research which is of this kind is research which proves that left-wing or liberal dogmas are correct. In other words, left-wing or liberal dogmas can only be proven correct via fraudulent, manipulated, or generally bad research. But before I look into that, a quick word from our sponsor. Well, first, a word from our sponsor. Now, we are all which telling the truth is an example of something that is sacred. Left-wing people are high in the moral foundations of equality and harm avoidance, but they are low in sanctity, group orientation, and obedience to authority, and they're also lower in conscientiousness, and therefore one would expect them to be more inclined to lie. They are individualists that are concerned with their individual power, as opposed to people that are concerned with the power and prestige of the group to which they belong. Indeed, they identify with members of out-groups, which allow them, of course, to collaborate with these members of out-groups against their in-group to gain individual power. In a way that is not the case with conservatives. Conservatives identify with their in-group. We know that these people, the left, are higher in Machiavellianism, that is to say they desire power, and they are higher in narcissism, that is to say they want to be worshipped and admired. The reason for this is that they are highly mentally unstable. 50% of young girls under the age of 30 who identify as extremely liberal have serious mental health problems, and therefore if you are mentally unstable like this, then you fear the world and you want to take control of it, and also you have low self-esteem, and so you want to be admired and looked up to as a way of dealing with your sense of low self-esteem. You create a false, vulnerable narcissistic self which tells yourself that you're brilliant. Such people also fear an open fight, and therefore in order to attain power they virtue signal, they go on about equality and harm avoidance, they covertly play for status, which is underpinned by the fact that they are very high, that they have very low self-esteem, and so they dare have a clear fight. Now we know that
this is Edward Dutton talking about how almost all scientific fraud in psychology just so happens to back up leftist dogmas. You'll notice that a tremendous amount of fraud in journalism also just tends to happen to back up leftist dogmas. Right, here's Michael Tracey talking with Richard Hanania.
Not proven beyond a reasonable doubt by any stretch. Even still, a lot of the indictments that were made pursuant to that particular charge, and as well as the indictments that were brought by Mueller against like the Internet Research Agency, so like the troll farms in St. Petersburg and stuff, they were crafted in a way where they knew deliberately, they knew that they would never actually have to go to trial. And on the rare occasions where actually some of the Russians that were indicted sought proactively to defend themselves in court, the cases were dismissed. So a lot of the stuff that people kind of assume is proven even today with regard to Russiagate, and even with regards to like the maybe more like somewhat plausible stuff like the DNC hacking, still there's some open questions, at least in my mind. But anyway, that's not really the most important part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so you think even today, at least preponderance of the evidence, so it's a good chance at least that was true. And then it's like not crazy to ask, like, okay, they wanted Trump to win. Like, it's not crazy to ask that, right? To report on, to consider that a possibility. So yeah, I think some of the Maddow reporting was particularly bad. I didn't think the New York Times was that bad. Like,
consider it a possibility, but okay, here's why I have to sort of push back on that to some degree, because one thing that I remember reporting on, I think this was in the summer of 2018, I forget what exactly prompted it, because like every day, or at least every week was this new bombshell Russiagate mania story that everybody had to like rush to Twitter to like give their take on. And, I remember because I was seen as like a skeptic every time, when it came out, like Don Jr. met at Trump Tower with Natalia Vilskaya, this Russian lawyer. Now what, Tracey? I mean, you're proven wrong, you idiot. And of course, later, even Mueller later discredited that whole. So let's just take that one example. Okay, that's actually a good, decent point. I don't know how closely you were following this at the time, but in July, I believe, of 2017, it came out that Don Jr. Met with this Russian lawyer who claimed to have information on Hillary Clinton at Trump Tower, and that caused like one of the many endless meltdowns from that period, and was seen as all but conclusive proof that the collusion theory was correct. Me and Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and Aaron Mate, we were all dead wrong and just then humiliated. And that was just basically the consensus interpretation of that event. And even the Mueller report, which is very flawed in a lot of ways, but even the Mueller report, to the extent that it investigated that incident, basically just undermined any sense that it was at all like inculpating of Don Jr. or proved anything resembling collusion, right? But there was a harm done in the sense that for like a month in July 2017, lots of people were just fervently convinced of a total falsehood that distorted their perceptions of American politics writ large on lots of different levels, because the media was so obsessively promoting this story with that particular spin. I think that's bad unto itself, not because I care that much about Don Jr. being wronged, that's a component of it. I mean, if you're like besmirched wrongly by the media, I mean, you are wronged, but because the country was wrong, the popular understanding was wrong. I mean, what we're talking about valuing here is like putting good information out into the universe. That did the opposite. And so, I don't know, I'm a bit hesitant to just, sweep it under the rug.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you that there are mistakes, there are narratives that are, harmful and
I don't
wrong.
think that's the thing. I don't think it was a mistake. I don't think that the correct word for what happened there is a mistake. I think there was intentionality behind it, not in that they were intentionally promoting what they knew to be factual falsehoods, but that they were so committed to a particular narrative.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Or that it was willfully done. It wasn't as though they committed an innocent mistake. Their intentional acts produced wrongful effects.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I mean by mistake. Someone can make a mistake because they're blinded by partisan rage. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so my piece is not about the media being perfect, just can't do any wrong, and they maintain the highest professional standards and nothing. I say there are entire areas where they're just as mad as those people on Twitter, following around Klaus Schwab. It's just the idea. The idea is basically, look, blind media hatred is bad, and take it as a whole. Like, take Russiagate and WMDs. Okay, these two things that happened in the last 20 years. Put it with everything else in the world, right? Like, we and you sit here and we talk about, the New York Times said this about the Ukraine war, the Washington Post said this. Look at the business coverage, the economy coverage. It's mostly good. It's mostly useful. It's mostly good source of information, and it's better than these people who criticize it and what else is out there.
Yeah, no, I agree with you in that regard. Like, even those Russiagate stories from 2017, 18, like the worst offenders, like I could pull up. Like one.
Right. So a sense of perspective is important. Richard Hanania makes this point in his essay. So critics of capitalism don't really offer an alternative, right? Capitalism's a flawed system, but what's better? Socialism. So the United States is a flawed country, but which great power do you think is doing things more effectively, more efficiently, more righteously? So you have to compare what the United States is doing to other countries in the real world. You have to compare the flaws of capitalism with the flaws of other alternative economic systems. And when you make critiques of, say, the American news media, you have to compare it vis-a-vis, say, other forms of the news media. You can't just critique it as falling short of some impossible standard of perfection.
One that comes to mind is there was this big bombshell report that was leaked to the New York Times, I want to say February or March of 2017, so pretty shortly after Trump came into office, where they were fed these anonymous leaks about Russian contacts that people in Trump's orbit had made. Like they tallied up the number of contacts and like, what is a contact? Like they counted Jeff Sessions shaking Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador's hand at the Republican convention, as a contact. So stuff like that. Even when I would read that piece, it's not as though my reaction would have been, this entire article is just a lie, right? It's that, no, the presentation of this article and the method by which the information was obtained and disseminated is fundamentally deceitful and causing these wrongful impacts. But it would have been overly nihilistic and wrong unto itself to just dismiss it as a, quote, lie. And that's what a lot of conservatives who are of this bent tend to do. They have this blanket dismissal of the New York Times, even though, as you point out, like, you'll often catch them citing the New York Times to bolster their own critique. And yeah, I mean, what would you and I have done? I mean, what the hell we would have done over this past year without the New York Times? I'm sorry, that's just the case with regard to Ukraine, right? And it was only because of the New York Times that we know that the U.S. government alleged that basically the Ukraine special forces committed a terror car bombing against the daughter of Dugin, right? Or that they did these long-range drone strikes in April against the Russian strategic nuclear fleet.
So here's an interesting tweet from Richard Hanania. The media is honest and good because most of what it does is not wokeness. It does a pretty decent job of it. Same is emphatically not true for academia in the social sciences and the humanities. And he says here, when it comes to the social sciences and the humanities, trying to discredit and destroy the whole thing is more justifiable. Interesting perspective.
And on and on and stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, if you're just going to then denounce the entire institution as, 100% irredeemable, and you have no alternative, and you're just in the peanut gallery, and like if you log on to Breitbart or like Steven Crowder or whatever, all you're getting is like nonstop making fun of college students with blue hair, which I can enjoy as much as everybody now and then, but like that's not going to really inform you much about important topics elsewhere in the world. And you're I think I agree with you that they've lost the plot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that stuff. Like, I came out of academia, and I hate the wokes. I mean, I really hate their stuff. But it gets all.
So, is the news really the best way of finding out what's going on around the world? Often, you'll find out better information by talking to people, by getting unofficial sources of information, by reading a book, by listening to a podcast, by watching a live stream. So, there are plenty of dissident or fringe sources of information that are frequently much more accurate than mainstream sources of information. So it all depends on which sources of information you consume and how critically you evaluate them.
Old after how many times could you read a story about a college student saying, licking an ice cream cone is white supremacy? Like, okay, like I've seen like a million versions of that story, and I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, you think these people they just have I don't know, it's like maybe there's some people who just like eat the same kind of meal every day for like their whole lives. I think it's like somewhere like those people. They just want to hear the exact same thing every day, forever. And there's nothing, I consider nothing valuable there. And you're absolutely right. And so The question is that, all of us who are thinking people who read the media and consume the media and we critique it because, all smart people have to have some kind of critique of the media. I mean, they're not going to be perfect. We need to think about what's the correct language to use. Like, how should we talk about the press? How should we engage with it? Like, I mean, I tell you, maybe you don't hang out with as many right wingers as I do, but it's vicious. I mean, it's like they're the enemy. Some of them just have a blanket rule: never talk to a journalist. Like, they're just your enemy. They hate you. It's just kind of the New York Times. They make an stick, and that's just unhealthy. And
but they'll have journalists. They'll have a handful of heterodox journalists or whatever term they use that they actually do like. Yeah, so they don't really believe their own rhetoric if they're saying never talk to any journalist.
Yeah, I mean sometimes, and sometimes sometimes they don't know enough to know.
Like when they say never talk to Barry Weiss.
Yeah, no, of course, it's not Fox News, right? That is the enemy. It's the left wing press. But you see it all the time. Like don't trust the media. There's no they'll say here's WMDs. Okay, so never believe anything they say. Again, some people are not reading the New York Times. They're just reading Twitter and they're seeing the dunks on the bad stuff that comes from New York Times or BuzzFeed or whatever. And these people have a very, very distorted view of the world, and so I try to provide a corrective.
Yeah, and one irony there is I'm almost positive that the New York Times would love to have maybe a minority, but a healthy minority of staffers who were, generally speaking, conservative, right of center, something, but were competent journalists and were smart and had analytical insights and just like a general acuity for the craft. I think that I could very easily imagine the management at the New York Times actively desiring that. And I mean, look, they have tried to recruit columnists over the years that are conservatives. I mean, Ross Douthat, I mean, he knows how to keep it within certain limits. I'm not saying he does this arbitrarily or just to be an appeaser or anything. But he does have, full-fledged conservative worldview, even if he's kind of more congenial than some others. And they hired him. I think he was ridiculously young. I think he was like 29 or something when they hired him as the New York Times columnist. And so there's and that's been sort of a recurring tendency. I mean, I don't think they always hire the right people. I mean, David French, please. But I've seen Daniel McCarthy, the former editor of the American Conservative. He has smart guy, competent guy. Not like some just crazy bomb thrower. He's got stuff in the New York Times now and then, and so lots of others. I mean, so this idea that there's just this prohibition on any sort of featuring of conservative thought in the New York Times is just not true. But yeah, they're not going to have some just wild rant that's not factually grounded that would maybe play to the conservative masses and parts of that audience and convince them that the New York Times is hospitable to them. They have higher standards, and I think they would probably genuinely desire for more conservatives to be able to meet those standards.
Yeah, I think that's right. A lot of people, they get confused because they think, oh, the New York Times doesn't pay attention to me, or these liberals don't engage with me. And it's often because you're not really contributing anything to the world, right? It's not because you're conservative, right? It's a lot of people who are conservative will blame that for people not taking them seriously, or people not wanting to deal with them. Yeah, I mean, I've been, I looked up just for the article and I wrote about it. I looked up how many times I've been cited in the New York Times, Washington Post, 10, 11 times between them. And then a bunch of research that CSPI does, I mean, multiple times. And, every single time, it's been good. I mean, it's been fair representation. I don't get that from people on Twitter, usually. And so, yeah, this is, I've benefited from engaging with the media, and I think, other people should too. What's your experience? I mean, does the Times Washington Post, have you been mentioned? How do you feel about it?
I think as a whole, it might be slightly more negative than you, just because, if I'm going to be cited in the New York Times somewhere, it's not because I have research that I'm presenting to them, from my think tank or however your deal could be best described. It's mostly because they are glomming onto some probably Twitter generated controversy that I'm involved in. There have been exceptions when the Mueller.
Okay, I have to run out. Talk to you guys later. Bye bye.